So, in this lecture, we're going to talk a bit about animalism and contrast it with something called the Constitution view, which was argued for most consistently by a philosopher called Lynn Rudder Baker. But it's related to constitutionalism, which is quite a popular view in the philosophy of material objects that we've looked at. She just applied it specifically to the topic that is generally known as personal identity. All right, as usual, we have to touch base with Locke, who's sort of the progenitor of this debate in certainly modern philosophy. And Locke, as we should know by now, drew a distinction between me as a man, as he put it, or basically a living thing or an animal, and me as a person. And said essentially that I am both of these things. Now, if you had to ask, but which one am I really, or most fundamentally, or most importantly, then Locke sides with the person. And famously, of course, he comes up with this thought experiment where the animal and the person part ways. And this is the cobbler and the prince and the cobbler, where basically a prince wakes up one morning to find that he is in the body of a cobbler. Now, in merely describing it that way, I'm sort of prejudiced towards the person. That is, by saying he woke up in the body of a cobbler, I'm immediately denying that it's the body that makes the individual. Because someone who thought that it was the body that was most basically the individual would say that the cobbler woke up believing himself to be the prince, mistakenly. But certainly when you run that thought experiment with just about any audience, they side with Locke and say, yes, if you had to say where is the prince when the consciousness is swapped bodies, they go with the consciousness rather than with the body. Okay, so Locke provided identity conditions for both of these things. So you have two different types of things. You have animals and you have persons. And he said, what makes an animal is, so what makes something a part of an animal, what makes the limits of an animal at any moment, that's called synchronic identity because it's at any frozen moment in time. What are the limits of this animal? And they are what, he says, for any organism, there is a single life that animates all of the parts of it. So, for example, he says, if I cut off my hand and it's no longer alive, it's no longer part of me as an animal. Even if you cut off my hand and then you attached it to some artificial respirator and you kept my hand living, it would be in some sense alive, but it wouldn't participate of the single life that animates me. Now, this notion is actually a fairly complicated one that needs investigation. And one complaint I have about animalism is that they don't really do a good job of investigating this. Because obviously, there's at least two kinds of life going on in any animal. Each of the cells in my body has its own life, so that if you can separate out living cells from any organism and possibly keep them alive. But there is, in some sense, a single unifying life, which is why I call it a life rather than just life, that keeps all of these things organized. So in some sense, this is a functional notion because a living organism needs at least needs most of its parts to keep this going. So you could say my heart tissue is alive, and you can keep a heart alive for a little while, sort of independently of the original owner, but it no longer participates in the life of the owner. It now has a life that is distinct, and it's not self-supporting. So, for example, Olson insists that what makes an animal is it has to be self-supporting. So he would say that the heart, if you have to put it on its own artificial respiration, isn't an animal by itself. It's just a part of an animal because it is not self-supporting. But anyway, so the limits of me are what participates of this life, which allows animals to be constantly rotating through different stuff. So this is a quote I use all the time, and I wish I know who first came up with it. I think Chisholm, maybe. But an animal is like a slow motion fountain, in the sense that just as a fountain takes in new water and throws it, so it's constantly changing the water that it's made of. And the organism is doing that. It takes in food, turns it into cells, sloughs off dead cells. You know, your household dust is dead skin cells. So a puzzle is, how can I be the same organism when I'm made of new cells, supposedly all new cells every 7 or 8 years? And the answer is because what doesn't change, the thing that remains the same throughout the life of an organism or animal, is the life. And it's the life that, so for example, when I take in new stuff, it now participates in the life. And when I shed off old stuff, it ceases to participate in that life. So long as a single life is animating me, then I exist as the same animal. So if I died, if it was possible for me to die and then be reanimated like, you know, Frankenstein's monster, then Frankenstein's monster, even if he wasn't made of the parts of several different individuals, suppose, you know, or a reanimated corpse like in Reanimator, great movie. Presumably, if it's an entirely new life that's reanimating something that was dead, then that wouldn't be the same animal. It would look the same, and it would be made of the same stuff as when it died, but it would be a new animal because it's a new life. Okay, so that's the idea that Locke has about what the identity conditions for an animal, of which a human is an example. Humans are animals. They're not vegetables or minerals or fungi. Persons, he said famously, are the identity conditions are consciousness. And I don't want to go into Locke. I've talked about Locke enough in other videos. Self-consciousness is important. But the limits of me are defined, my synchronic identity as a person is determined by consciousness. Now, Olson talks a little bit about this and says this is actually kind of a silly idea. And I always thought this because that seems to suggest that the person is smaller than the animal. Because I am not. Because what Locke is talking about is, can you feel it? So in other words, he would say my hand is part of me because I can feel it. And of course, if you chop it off, it's no longer part of me as a person because I can't feel it. But of course, there's actually very little I can feel that's part of my body. I can't feel inside my bones. I can't feel my atoms. I can't feel my blood. All of these things that we would normally say are part of me would not be part of my person. So if you were to draw a person, I don't know, it would look like the nervous system or something. And that's not the idea that modern philosophers like, for example, Baker, have about persons. Baker and most people who you might call personists, who say that what we are most essentially is a person, think of persons as material objects that basically are exactly the same as the animal. So if you were to point at me as a person, most contemporary personists would say, it's this thing. This is a person. Now, of course, it also appears to be an animal. And Locke didn't really go into how you can be both of those things. And this is where this is the point that Olson and other animalists have sort of hammered at repeatedly. They've said, hold on a minute. How can I be both of those things? I have to be, now, you can say, you can get into this and say, well, we can draw a distinction between, if one of them is a substance, to use sort of the ancient terminology, and the other is a property of that substance or a phase of that substance, then it's easy to understand. So, for example, I am an animal. I'm a human being, but I'm also somebody in his 50s. I can't say teenager. I can't say there isn't a noun for somebody in their 50s. Probably you could construct one in Latin, like a 90-year-old as a nonagenarian. I don't know what a 50-year-old would be. Something genarian. It's easier if you point at a teenager and say, well, that teenager is a human being, despite the way they act sometimes, but it's also a teenager. Which one is it? And the answer is, of course, human being. Teenager is just a phase it's going through. Now, Olson is prepared to allow that person is a phase, because what he says is, just like teenager, you pre-exist that phase, and if you're lucky, you don't behave as a stupid teenager, you post-exist that phase. As what? As an animal. So what we are animals, and we go through certain phases. Teenager, person is one of those phases. For example, we start out as animals as non-persons, because certainly a blastocyst isn't conscious. And depending on how you define consciousness, how strict you are about it, we might not become conscious until late on in pregnancy or even after birth. Baker, for example, instead of consciousness, Baker says the defining feature of a person is a first-person perspective. And she says that fetuses absolutely don't have those. Now, she later sort of becomes a little looser and allows that there are sort of pre-persons that have a kind of primitive version of this, and we might count them as persons too. But a fully fledged person has to have this first-person perspective, which is fairly sophisticated. It might be like Locke's notion of self-consciousness, which most animals, other than human beings, seem to lack. They don't seem to be aware of themselves as persons. And so Locke would say they're not self-conscious, so they're not persons. And Baker would say that they don't have this first-person perspective. So persons are also important concepts, and this is something that Locke points out, because it seems to be the personhood that is important when we're judging things like praise and blame. So, for example, if my body commits a crime under the control of some mind manipulator, then it doesn't seem like I did it. My body did it. My body is covered with the blood of my victim, but it's not really my victim because the person didn't do it. The person was being blocked by the mind manipulator, let's say. So when it comes to whether or not I should be praised or blamed for something, the important thing is to know if it was me as a person that did it. So certainly personhood is, as Locke calls it, a forensic concept, or it's to do with morality. And personhood comes up a lot in ethical debates, particularly things like abortion. Is a fetus a person? Both Olson and Baker would deny that certainly early fetuses are persons. Interestingly, although some anti-abortion philosophers are drawn to animalism because it says that we were fetuses, so we start to exist as fetuses, and from that they want to derive an anti-abortion position, because if we are already existing as fetuses, then in some sense to kill the fetus is to kill us. So they think that animalism can help them in this. Animalism by itself is not necessarily an anti-abortion position, because Olson is only interested in metaphysical questions. He doesn't actually find ethical questions interesting, and I think he's pro-choice. He actually believes that it's not wrong to kill a fetus. If you're going to get into ethics, personhood is more important. He would agree with that. What he's interested in is the metaphysical question. All right, so how can it be that we are both person and animal, particularly if, as Baker and modern personists seem to suggest, they're exactly the same entity? All of the atoms that compose the animal compose the person. Now, if you define person in terms of consciousness, it seems easy to suggest, well, maybe consciousness, that might be to do with my soul or something like that. Now, there are substance dualists still to this day who argue that, yes, I am an immaterial thing separate from the material animal. But that's not the view of most people who would count themselves as personists. It's not the view of Derek Parfit. It's not the view of David Lewis. It's not the view of Lynn Rudder Baker. They would all agree that we are material things. What material things? This, the thing that is obviously an animal. So what Olson says is we seem to be drawn to four claims that form an inconsistent set. You can't believe all four of them. They contradict. They are a contradiction if you believe all four. So you have to deny at least one of them. What are they? One, we are material things. Now, as I said, there are substance dualists who would deny that, and that's their way to solve the problem. But it's not a way that any of the philosophers were interested in. They don't deny that one. They all agree that, yes, we're material things. We're made of atoms. Atoms and no immaterial stuff. If you destroy my brain in some sense, I'm definitely gone. Well, not necessarily for Olson, but anyway. We are material things, and we are in the same location as an animal. That is, exactly where the animal is, there is the person. The boundaries of the animal are the boundaries of the person. Except if you go back in time. And now, this is, you can get out of this inconsistency if you are someone like David Lewis, who is a four-dimensionalist. And you can say, well, sure, right now, the boundaries of the person and the boundaries of the animal are exactly the same. But we can differentiate between them if we're four-dimensionalists, because, of course, if this is a fetus and this is somebody in a persistent vegetative state, in between, here's where they achieve consciousness and here's where they lose consciousness, their cortex dies. The time worm that comprises the animal is this long, the time worm that comprises the person is this long, so they are not identical. In some sense, the person is a proper part of the animal. It is, but it is not one and the same. And there's no problem with that. There's no problem with saying that a person is a part of an animal because you're not making an identity claim. You don't have to choose, well, which one am I? You can say, okay, I, the person, am a part of an animal in the same way that, my heart is a part of an animal. So, and there are actually three-dimensionalist versions of this that say that we are not whole entire animals, we are parts of animals. Jeff McMahon is a philosopher who argues for the embodied mind idea that essentially says we are parts of brains. That's what we are. We're material objects, but we're not whole animals. But Lynn Rudder Baker certainly agrees that we are right now. Lynn Rudder Baker is not a four-dimensionalist. She says we exist entirely at any moment in time. So this is the animal and this is the person at the same time. But we are not an animal. Now, if you call a person what in the terminology that Olson uses a phase sortal, so person is like teenager, then you can be an animal and a person because you're not, the person isn't the substance. You can talk in terms of kinds of thing. And you can talk in terms of fundamental kinds. And if you ask, but what am I really? The answer should be a fundamental kind. At bottom, what are you really? You're an animal, according to Olson. Whereas Baker, for example, would agree with this. I'm not most fundamentally. She wouldn't deny that I am an animal, but in a way, she can't do what Olson says. Olson can say, I am an animal and I am a person. But person isn't a real thing any more than teenagers are a thing. There are no, for one thing, he says, if there's a real kind of thing, then it must have persistence conditions. That is, what does it take for it to persist through time? And he says persons don't have that. Because one of the things about persons is, in theory, all kinds of fundamental kinds of things could also be persons. Humans can be persons. Possibly dolphins can be persons. The more we find out about dolphins, the shittier they turn out to be. So don't find out about dolphins. But they're certainly smart. And they almost certainly have a first-person perspective and maybe self-consciousness too. But also artificial intelligence could be a person. Like there's an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation when they debate whether or not Data has rights because, is he a person in the right sense? And they conclude basically he is. And of course, if you believe in, if you're religious, you could believe God is a person, or angels are persons, or, if there is intelligent life out there, then E.T. would be a person, Superman, who's an alien, would also be a person. So personhood, the persistence conditions for persons can't be to do with organic life or a specific kind of organic life. It has to be, what would it be? I mean, Olson says, well, you tell me. Now, Locke would say consciousness. It has to be, or Parfit says relation R. But that doesn't really tell you the persistence conditions for persons. That tells you the persistence conditions for individuals, individual persons. So it is, a person. I persist by being in relation R to things in the past and things in the future. The things in the future remember being me. I remember being the things in the past. My intentions now are carried out by future me. That's all part of relation R. But is that really the persistence conditions for a kind of thing? Whereas he says we do have persistence conditions for animals. They are this notion of a life. Now, of course, an opponent of animalism could start to say, well, I need to know more about what this life business. It seems poorly defined. But let's give him that for the moment. So he would say the only real kind that's going on there is animal. We are animals. Let's be blunt and honest about this. If you say what kind of thing I am, it's an animal. Everything else is derivative. Philosophy professor, sure, I'm that, but at bottom, I'm an animal. Philosophy professor is just something that this particular animal does. But what kind of thing am I? I'm an animal. Baker, on the other hand, and this is tied into, Olson has what he calls a sparse ontology, which appears to be just like Van Inwagen, who was very influential on Olson. Although Van Inwagen is religious and Olson definitely isn't. Van Inwagen is almost what we called a nihilist. That is, somebody who doesn't believe in things. That is, chairs don't really exist. All that exists are the atoms, the simples, the most basic subatomic particles. Those exist, but nothing else exists bigger than that. So chairs don't exist. You just have subatomic particles arranged in a chairy fashion. He's almost a nihilist, that is Van Inwagen, except he believes that there is one kind of macro kind of thing, and that's animals. Because animals, he says, have this organizing principle. So whereas chairs are not self-organizing objects, they're just artificial objects. We take particles and we arrange them into chair shapes. Animals are self-organizing. So that, in a sense, makes them a thing because they exist independently. And this appears to be Olson. So he doesn't call it nihilism because it's not quite nihilism. It's the sparse ontology. So this comes up in discussion of the statue and the clay. Whereas Baker has a much more generous ontology in that she believes not only are there animals, there's all kinds of other kinds of things. There are statues. There are persons are also kinds of things. So, but if you ask, what am I most fundamentally, she would say, I am a person most fundamentally. I am also, she says, an animal, but in a sort of derivative way. But unlike with Olson, who says that animal is the only kind involved there, if you talk about persons, they're just sort of invented things. Sure, we can talk about them in the same way that we talk about chairs, but they're not real. Baker would say, no, they're both real, and I happen to be a person most fundamentally. So that's the difference between them. So Olson, of course, would deny that we're not an animal, but this is certainly Baker's view. I am not an animal, at least I am not numerically identical with an animal. There is an animal right here, but it's not me. Well, this is where Baker and Olson would bicker about terminology. Because Baker would say, we are animals, but she says, I'm using the is of constitution. So you can say, I am X and I am Y. So Baker could say, I am a person and I am an animal. How can that be if they're kinds of things? This is like being a vegetable and a mineral. how can you be both of those kinds of things? It seems like you can only be one fundamental kind of thing. And her solution is to say, well, when I say I am a person, I'm using the is of numerical identity, being one and the same with. When I say I am an animal, I'm using the is of constitution. And she says constitution is unity, being one, without identity. And at this point, having interviewed Olson, I'll post that video as well. I can just imagine him doing this. You know, what the fuck? You know, this is not. What do you mean? You can use is in two different ways. That just sounds like cheating. Two material things cannot co-locate. This is a principle that it seems to be basic to our way of thinking about the universe. If you have a simplest particle, and you look and you see a simple particle in your incredibly powerful magnifying glass, that's only one particle. There cannot be a simple particle also there, sort of in the same place. It's just a fact about matter that one piece of matter pushes another piece of matter out. You can't say, well, there could be infinite pieces of matter on the same spot. Now, if immaterial stuff exists, then of course you can have a material object and an immaterial thing in the same location. That's, for example, Descartes' idea. Well, except Descartes thinks that immaterial things don't have location. But if you believe that souls can exist in a place too, then you could say, here's my body and my soul. And that's okay because they're not the same kind of thing. But if they're both material objects, then you can't have two material objects in the same place. So how is it that I am the same location as an animal, and I'm a material thing? Two material things can't be in the same place, but I'm not the animal. That seems impossible. Now, what Baker is going to deny is that two material things cannot co-locate. You can have a person and an animal be in the same place. Qualitatively, so constitutionalism is the view that qualitatively different things, it must be that they have different properties, because otherwise then you're saying, if you're saying an atom exists here and another atom exists here and they're exactly the same in their properties, that seems to violate the principle. And why would you how would we ever know that, and how would we count them? It just seems pointless. But our reason for being constitutionalists, if we think that there are two different things here and they have different properties. And here's where the example of the statue of the clay seems to support constitutionalism, or the best way to understand what's going on in the statue in the clay leads to constitutionalism. So the statue in the clay, we've looked at this before, just to go over it again. There is a lump, so you've got a lump of clay. It's shapeless. You form it into a statue of a person, and then you squash it, because you think that art should be ephemeral, or you're displeased with your artwork, but for whatever reason you squash it. So here is the lump of clay. It exists, let's say, here's where we get it out of the ground and it starts existing, and here's where we atomize it for some reason. So it exists this length. Actually, it's more likely to exist much longer. But, for our purposes, the lump exists that length of time. Now, there is also an essentially shaped statue, S, and that exists for as long as the clay is statue-shaped. S, when it exists, coincides materially with L. In this period, you can say that this is S, but it's also L, because if you say that it's just S, then the problem is what happened to L in this juncture. So if you say that you can only be one kind of a thing at a time, and you say, well, this is a statue right now, then we would have to say that L does not exist in this stretch. But then we would want to say, well, this is the same lump of clay as that. So you would have to say that L ceases to exist here and then comes back into existence here. And then the question is, well, where did L go? And it seems obvious to say, no, L's here the whole time. But if you say that L is here the whole time, and you say, well, point to the statue, there it is. Is it essentially a statue? Yes. Well, all right, now point to the lump. Wait a minute, you're pointing to the same thing. Is that essentially a lump? And if you say yes, but I thought you just said that was essentially a statue. Now, the lump, L, right here, L exists. And L has a property right here of being able to survive squashing. And just to prove it, we squash it and it continues to exist. Meanwhile, S exists here and doesn't have the property of being able to survive squashing. This kind of property is what you might call a modal property, because you can't necessarily see it by looking at the thing. You can't say, I can see by looking at this that it will survive squashing. So in what sense does it have it? Because in another possible world, L is squashed and exists, and S is squashed and ceases to exist. So it's a property that we can only, like a counterfactual property. It's a property that we know it has without being able to necessarily empirically measure it as it is now. All right, but so there is the sense in which they are qualitatively different. They are, if you look at them, materially, they are atom for atom identical. So scientifically, in terms of all the things that science can measure, they're identical. And yet, we can distinguish between them in terms of their modal properties, let's say. How do we explain this? This seems to lead, the most obvious explanation of this seems to be that S is constituted by L. The reason why S and L can both exist at the same time is because S is made up of L, where constitution can be unity without identity. I can be, so of course what Baker does is apply this to the animal-person relationship. And she says, I am most fundamentally the statue, I am most fundamentally the person, but it's true that the person is made of exactly the same atoms as an animal that pre-existed me. So Baker is quite happy to say that I did not exist in utero. Something existed in utero, and something that became me, and it's the animal that composes me. Sorry, not composes, because composition is a many-to-one relationship. You are composed of your atoms. Constitution is a one-to-one relationship. So that's why we have to talk about lumps of things. The statue is composed of the lump, or the person is constituted by the animal. The statue is constituted by the lump. You could say the statue is composed of atoms, and so is the lump. But the statue is constituted by the lump. Okay. Now, how do you explain this if you're not a constitutionalist? Well, Olson goes into some possibilities. He could say you think that only the statue exists and there is no lump. Or that would be statuism, or only the lump exists and there is no statue. And he says that's kind of weird. But he says the position he holds is the sparse ontology, that there is no statue and there is no lump. There's just clay, there's just atoms. So something exists that you can describe as a statue or you can describe as a lump. But really it isn't either of those things. So there's no problem of saying that it's one and the same object is two different things. He says it's neither of those things. So what you want to avoid, unless you believe in constitutionalism, is you want to avoid, you don't want to violate this. So if you say that is a statue, it can't be a lump. Or if you say that is a lump, it can't be a statue. Constitutionalists say, no, I'm going to say that it's both of those things. Olson says, I'm going to avoid the problem by saying that it's neither of those things. Why? Because he has sparse ontology. He doesn't believe in statues. He doesn't believe in lumps. He doesn't believe in chairs. He's a nihilist, except he believes in animals. Animals are this special self-organizing kind of object. So they get to exist. Persons are not like that. All right. Now, this in green right here is Olson's reasons for being an animalist. And essentially, they're negative reasons. They're reasons not to be anything else. And he says, okay, the fetus problem. The fetus problem says, okay, you people like Parfit and Baker and Lewis, you say you're essentially a person. Then you were never a fetus. Now, right then, you might have a problem with that. That seems counterintuitive to say, I remember when our first child, when we had our first child, we were in Arkansas, and we went to a hospital and we got a sonogram, or whatever you call it. And it's a picture of this, it looks like a outline of this weird creature. You can barely see what it is. And they gave it to us in a little framed picture saying, baby's first picture. Now, you can see that they had kind of an agenda. They let us know that if we decided we weren't going to go forward with the pregnancy, maybe we got bad news about its development, they were not going to do the abortion. We would have to find somewhere else. This was pre-Roe versus Wade being overturned, of course. So they were sort of pushing an agenda here, baby's first picture. That's a damn ugly baby, I thought. That's not something I would want to frame because they do look kind of alien at that stage. But certainly, most people would say, that was me as a fetus. Whereas if you believe that you're essentially a person, you say, no, that's not me. I didn't exist. I only come into existence when consciousness starts, or when first-person perspective. But that by itself is not the fetus problem. It's a problem. It's already a bit of a weird thing to say. That's not actually that's not actually our baby. But some personalists are perfectly okay with that. No, the real fetus problem is yet to come. If you say the fetus, if that's not you, then it can't become you. That is, it's sort of a precursor to you. It didn't become you because it's not essentially you. And then the question is, well, where did it go? This is a bit like if you say that the statue, this is a bit like statuism. If you say that I am essentially a statue, well, it's as if you're saying that the lump ceased to exist for a while. Because if you say I'm not a lump of clay, well, then there was a lump of clay before. Where did it go? And that's the question. The fetus seems to go out of existence. And where did you come from? You seem to have popped into existence. So that's the fetus problem. Now, how much of a problem you think it is, I think depends on how sort of embedded in metaphysical thinking you are. Because I've never found Olson's arguments, like, oh my God, I've got to change my views because of this. Maybe because I'm not so enmeshed in issues of ontology. But there you go, that's the fetus problem. Perhaps a more serious problem is the thinking animal problem. Certainly a more intellectually taxing problem. And the thinking animal problem is, so animals are essentially animals. That's the definition of animals. They have, what makes them animals is their essential properties. So this is from Aristotle. Your essential properties are the things that make you the kind of thing you are. You can have other properties like furry, having a tail, having red blood, all of those other things, but they're not your essential properties. Your essential properties are properties such that if you didn't have them, you wouldn't be the kind of thing you are. So obviously the essential, animals are essentially animals. They are essentially living. But if, as personists claim, you or I are not essentially animals, we're essentially persons, then it looks like when I point at you, I'm not pointing at an animal. But I am also pointing at an animal. There's an animal here. This is an animal. So this is you and an animal, and they're not the same, but they are in the same place. Okay, then you ask, let's talk about the animal. I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about the animal now. You're a thing that is not essentially an animal, who happens to be right here at the same time. But I'm talking about the animal now. Can that animal, that is not you, think? Two answers. Well, there's three answers, one of which is there isn't an animal. But let's ignore that for the time being. But if you say there is an animal here, and it's not you, can it think? If you say it can't think, well, why not? That seems weird to say. The animal can't think. Now, someone, of course, if you're an immaterialist, like Descartes, you say, well, matter can't think. It's only immaterial stuff that can think. But there's all kinds of problems. There's the whole mind-body problem with that. But certainly most contemporary philosophers would say what does thinking is the matter. Like my brain thinks. My brain thinks. It's not a soul or a mind or something immaterial. It's my brain. If you destroy my brain, the thinking will be gone because it's the brain that does the thinking. So thinking is done by material stuff. That's what most contemporary philosophers believe. So if you're saying the animal doesn't think, but the animal's got everything that you've got that enables you to think, so why can't that animal think? So it's a puzzle if you say, why not? Now, possible suggestions for that is to say that the animal doesn't have certain key properties that you have to have in order to think. And he talks about Sidney Shoemaker, for example, suggests that only persons could think because persons have the persistence conditions, which are the modal properties. So presumably, because the animal has exactly the same physical properties as you, again, you're made of, atom for atom, made of exactly the same stuff. So if thinking is to do with properties of atoms, then obviously the animal can think. If you're going to claim that the animal can't think, it's going to have to be because it lacks some of these other properties that, for example, were what distinguish between the statue and the lump. Modal properties or mental properties. Now, Sidney Shoemaker suggests that persistence conditions, you need the right persistence conditions to think. And an animal persists biologically. What makes it the same animal is biological properties, life, whereas a person persists psychologically, and it's psychological properties that enable us to think. So that's Shoemaker's suggestion. So he suggests that this animal can't think, but it's certainly a weird counterintuitive view. Once again, I can picture Olson giving one of these looks. So the better solution, the better position to take seems to be that the animal thinks. Okay, well now we've got two thinkers. There's an animal here, it's thinking, but you're here, and remember you're not an animal, so the animal can't be you, so you have to be a separate thing, and you obviously think. So there's two thinkers right here. that leads to the overcrowding problem. Like we've got, if we want to count the number of thinkers in the world, how many are here? Now we've seen a problem. There's actually a problem like this for four-dimensionalism. Because remember we said constitutionalism has a solution to this, but so does four-dimensionalism. And four-dimensionalism also has an overcrowding problem, and we looked at that because there's a person here, but there's also a sub-person that doesn't exist as long as the person. So this Olson has similar complaints about four-dimensionalism as he does with anything other than animalism. So you have the overcrowding problem. It seems to be that you've got, how do we count how many thinkers there are in the world? If normally we would say there's one thing here and it's thinking one set of thoughts. But constitutionalism seems to say, no, there's at least two things. There's also the epistemic problem, epistemology to do with knowledge. I'm thinking, who's thinking the thoughts that I'm thinking? Is it me, the person, or is it the animal? How do I tell? Now, he says there is a suggested answer to this by somebody called Noonan, which he calls something like pronoun revisionism, which suggests that basically the argument is that we call them personal pronouns for a reason. So I is a personal pronoun because it refers by definition to persons. So there's a single thought, I am standing here. Who's thinking that thought? And Noonan suggests that it's, well, both of them are thinking it. This is actually the response that the four-dimensionalists used for the sub-persons problem. Both of them are thinking it, but when the person thinks it, I refers to them, as you normally expect I to do. But when the animal thinks it, the I refers to the person. So it doesn't refer, when the animal thinks it, I does not refer to it in the usual indexical way. It refers to the person. So both of them think a true thing about the person. So for example, if I think I didn't exist as a fetus, that's a true thing because the person is thinking, and it's also a true thing when the animal thinks it, even though, of course, the animal existed as a fetus, but what they're thinking is the person didn't exist as a fetus because I necessarily refers to the person. Let's see, again, I think Olson's onto something when he says that sounds a little bit suspicious. The personhood problem. Okay, what is it to be a person? It's to be conscious. Well, but if you say that the animal can think, so remember we're taking this second option, the animal can think, isn't the animal a person? So now remember, you're not that animal. We're talking about that animal. Isn't that animal also a person? And then you've got two persons. Now, what Baker is going to say is, look, this is all, you're all overcomplicating things just because you don't understand what constitution is. You think that the only way to be one and the same thing is identity. And obviously you're saying that the animal and the person are not identical because they're different kinds. But I say they are one and the same thing. So there's not two thinkers. Now what Olson can say in return, but they're not numerically identical, right? And Baker would have to say, you're right, they're not numerically identical, but they are one. They have a unity. It's the unity of constitution. And she says, her example, like the statue in the lump, is the granite in the Vietnam War memorial. If you've ever seen it, it's a long wall made of granite with all the names of the people who died in the Vietnam War carved on it. That was dug out of a quarry. But when the lump of granite that was turned into the Vietnam War Memorial was dug out of a quarry, it wasn't the Vietnam War Memorial. Once it's set up and carved, it's the Vietnam War Memorial, but we don't think that the granite evaporated. We think that the granite constitutes the Vietnam War Memorial. So this is where Constitution seems commonsensical. Olson is doing his level best to make Constitution seem weird. And Baker says, no, it's not weird at all. So she says there's not two thinkers, the animal and the person. There is one thought, I am a person, by the person, constituted by the organism. Now, elsewhere, she says things like this. You are a person non-derivatively. You are also an organism derivatively. Now, again, putting on my Olson shoes, what do you mean derivatively? What does that mean? Am I an animal or am I not? Well, you're not numerically identical with an animal. An animal constitutes you. If the animal went away, you wouldn't exist. If I destroyed the animal, I would destroy you. But you are not the animal. The animal, or at least, no, you're not non-derivatively the animal. You're only the animal derivatively. Now, in response to this, apart from incredulous stares, Olson has other questions. He says, when does Constitution occur? You've got all these examples. You say that the lump constitutes the statue. You say that the granite constitutes the Vietnam War Memorial. You say the animal constitutes me. Okay, but what's your general rule for when one thing constitutes another? Because he says Baker gives an example of an anvil not constituting a doorstep despite being used as a doorstop. Well, why not? What's the rule? He says, I don't get it. You're just using this when it's convenient for you, when it makes sense. But I need a general principle of constitution, and you can't give me one. What is it that makes one property constitute, having of a property constitute another thing? I need an explanation for this. Otherwise, I'm going to be skeptical. Also, what determines our boundaries? He says, I know what my boundaries are. They're determined by what's alive. Now, you can get into questions, well, then is my hair part of me? Because that appears to be dead. Is the bark part of a tree? And you can, so animalists or organismicists or whatever can disagree about our boundaries. You can say, I extend to some dead stuff. There's some dead skin cells, which because they're attached to me are part of me. Or you can say that I'm slightly smaller, as Olson seems to say, and it's just the living stuff, so my hair is not actually part of me. But still, I know why my boundaries are these. So why is it then that Baker seems to insist that the boundaries of the person are exactly the same as the boundaries of the animal? I mean, if you go by Locke, taking it literally, consciousness, it's going to be much smaller. Like it's going to include my nerve endings, but not my blood or my, the dead surface of the skin or whatever. So it's going to look like one of those diagrams you see of like the nervous system. It's not going to look like this. But Baker wants to say, no, this is the person. But where does she get off using the animal's boundaries to be the boundaries of the person's? What's the principle here? It seems like you're just helping yourself to the animal. Now, presumably Baker would say, well, look, the statue has the outlines that it does, and they're exactly the same outlines as the clay. But I think what Olson is pressing at is you say that the animal constitutes you, and why is it that the entirety of the animal constitutes you? Why isn't it, something smaller? Now that, of course, is what the something smaller approach is, the approach that Jeff McMahon and the embodied mind thinkers, or in generally philosophers who say that we're actually a brain rather than the whole body, for reasons that we'll see, do take. But it's not the position that people like Baker take. The indiscernibility problem, this is sort of a summary of a lot of these things. The indiscernibility problem is you say that the person and the animal have different properties. That's what we were talking about this. How do they have different properties when they're made of exactly the same thing? How is it that if I'm making an animal, I do it this way, and then if I'm making a person, I do exactly the same thing? Why is it, when is it that making the putting atoms together this way makes an animal, and when is it that it makes a person? And how is it that you can do one thing and achieve two different things? The person and the animal are indiscernible, and yet you are claiming that they begin to exist at different times. They have different modal properties. They have different persistence conditions. How? I don't get it. All right. So let's look at the most powerful criticisms of animalism. I think the knockdown criticism against animalism is cortex transplants. Okay, suppose, now obviously these are not possible. And why cortex rather than the entire brain? Because you can have, your cortex is what's responsible for consciousness. It is possible for your cortex to die and your body to continue to live. When this happens, sometimes you require an artificial respirator, like the famous case of Terri Schiavo, when they finally did an autopsy of Terri Schiavo. Her cortex was essentially liquid, so she hadn't been conscious for years. But the body was alive, it was respiring. And what controls the respiration of your body is the brain stem, which has nothing to do with consciousness. Consciousness is controlled by the cortex. Life functions can be maintained by just the cortex. You can have babies born without a cortex, anencephaly that's called. You can literally shine a light through their ears sometimes, or sometimes just that part of the head is missing. But they're alive. They're alive. They're breathing. They're pink, warm. The blood is circulating. They're just not conscious. I mean, there's a reason why it's called a vegetative state. Vegetables are alive, but incapable of consciousness, at least we hope. And that is true of people in a vegetative state. They have no awareness. They don't feel pain. They don't suffer. But they are alive. They are alive. The tissues are certainly, they have a life. They're not just the life in their cells. The system is working. The heart is pumping. The lungs are oxygenating the blood, and so on. All right. So in a cortex transfer, suppose your body is paralyzed or is in dire shape, and this amazing brain surgeon can take just your cortex and transplant it into this wonderful new body. So let's say this is an old body, this is a young body. If we did that, when this person would woke up after the operation, they would say, I'm this person. So let's say this is Joe. This person would say, I'm Joe. Here I am. I'm Joe. And you would say, but you look different. He says, it doesn't matter. I got a new body, but it's me. And, remember when we did this, and would tell you all these things that only Joe would know. So this person would insist that they are Joe. And animalists have to say, sorry, you're wrong. You're not Joe. Why aren't you Joe? Joe's here. Joe is the animal. The cortex is not the animal. The animal is the thing. So this, according to an animalist, and they admit this, if I donate a kidney, I'm still the same animal. So you can donate organs, so long as you remain alive, and remain the same animal. Somebody else now has my kidney. It's not part of me anymore. Well, as far as an animalist is concerned, the cortex is just another organ. Why? Because the persistence conditions or the identity conditions of animals have nothing to do with psychology. They just have to do with a life. So this is Joe. And let's say the body is still alive. They're keeping it alive, or it manages to stay alive because the brainstem still exists. Here's Joe. Joe's still alive. You can't be Joe. So animalists are committed to the view that this is Joe, not this. And I don't know anybody who isn't an animalist who believes that. I mean, this isn't just the Prince and the Cobbler, where it's some kind of magic that the consciousness is switched, but the brains stay the same. This is literally taking the part of you that does the thinking, the material part that has the consciousness, and going and putting it over here. So someone who is an embodied mind theorist, like Jeff McMahon, would say, well, obviously, my identity conditions are the identity conditions of the cortex, and the cortex has moved over here, so this is me. So you can be a materialist and believe and get the right answer that this is Joe. Animalists can't. They have to say that Joe stays here, don't know who this is, says it's Joe, but this is Joe. And that seems to be just so obviously the wrong answer that that's a deep problem for animalism. There's also the conjoined twins problem. And I did a video about an article that Jeff McMahon, embodied mind guy, and another person, Campbell, I think, wrote about the varieties of conjoined twins and how they present in different ways, and the combination of the various ways that you can be a conjoined twin just completely undermine animalism. It's worth looking at that article. But the simplest way is there's a type of conjoining where you have two heads and then basically single organs, basically two heads. It can be slightly different. Now, not many people survive this. The famous example that all philosophers talk about is the Hensel twins. And what's interesting about the Hensel twins is one of them got married and the other one didn't. And yet they have the same body, except for their heads. So they have two brains, they think different thoughts, but they share a bunch of organs. I don't know how many hearts they are. I think, just one. So wherever one of them goes, the other one has to go too. Now, how many lives are there in the body that has two heads? And an animalist pretty much has to say it's a single life. If one twin has a heart attack, the other twin has a heart attack, right? There's not two lives there. There's a single system that has two consciousnesses. If you're a personist, you could say, oh, there's two persons there. If you're an animalist, you have to say there's only one individual there. It seems like they got the wrong number. So this is an instance, a physical instance of one animal, two persons. There are many other possibilities. For example, Locke imagines in his chapter night man and day man. And what happens there is that the animal during the day remembers everything that happened during the day, and then during the night remembers everything that happened during the night, but doesn't remember anything that happened in the day, and in the day doesn't remember anything in the night. So two separate streams of consciousness. Two persons housed in one body. Hey, it's the plot of Severance. I don't know if they got it from Locke, but it's certainly there. And of course, there's a great scene in early on in Severance, I think it's the first episode, where Heli is confronted with, Heli, of course, is the innie of Helena. So as far as Heli's concerned, she's only existed for a few minutes. And she's told what happens. It's explained to her what's happened. Obviously, it's been explained to her outie because she agreed to the procedure. But the innie, as far as she knows, has only existed, literally has only existed for a few minutes. If you don't know the TV show, well, go and watch it. But the idea is that your consciousness can be severed by having a chip implanted in your brain so that when you're at work, you only remember what happened at work. And then when you leave, you switch to your outie consciousness and you only remember what happened outside in your out-of-work job. And ne'er the twain shall meet. You don't know what's going on in the other places. Now, Mark is telling Helly, basically he's giving her the speech. He's explaining how this all works. And she says, and Helly, who is obviously a personist, says, "So I never leave." Because, of course, if she's referring to herself as a person, it's true. Helly never leaves because this stream of consciousness will never have any memories of outside. And Mark says, no, you leave every day at a certain time. Well, he says, we stagger the leaving time so that we don't bump into each other outside. He's being an animalist because he's referring to her as the body, because of course the body gets to leave and become the outie. So there's the disagreement. Now, when it comes to conjoined twins, the right answer just seems to be that they are two persons, not a single organism. So when they die, we should have two funerals, right? Whereas the animalists would say, no, just one. Could you survive a gradual replacement with inorganic parts? I mean, Dick Cheney has had an artificial heart for a long time. Is he alive? Does he meet the condition of being self-supporting? What if we invent artificial kidneys? What if we invent artificial liver? What if we invent all of these things? What if you can replace each neuron with an artificial neuron? Because, we work out exactly the electrical activity of a neuron. We make a little artificial thing that does exactly that electrical activity. And when a neuron dies, we replace it with an artificial one. So gradually, over decades, every cell in your body is replaced with an artificial thing. Do you continue to exist? An animalist has to say, you get smaller and smaller, and presumably you can't get too small, otherwise it's not self-sustaining. So pretty soon, you cease to exist without even noticing it, because you don't know when you pass this threshold of not being a self-sustaining life. As far as you're concerned, you keep going. There's no noticeable difference psychologically of you. Whereas if you get sort of prosthetics right now, you have become smaller, according to Olson. So if you get prosthetic legs, suddenly you're just a torso, because that's the only thing that is alive. Those aren't your legs. Those are just things stuck onto you, because you are the living thing. And that just seems to be, again, the wrong answer. So those are the main criticisms of animalism as a view. All right, so what are you? Are you an animalist? Are you a constitutionalist? Or is it a pox on both their houses?